This is Antithesis, your underground academic radio where the focus is on you. For those that are in the thick of it today, we know what you are living through. And for those that chose or were forced onto a different path, we know what it costs. We're here to be your companion and to help you reorient your compass a bit, to help make sense of it all. Thanks for being here. The opinions expressed here are my own and do not reflect those of my employer or any entity professionally affiliated with me. Topics in these podcasts will be familiar to many, if not all, within the academic and scientific communities, within institutions, industries, and employers of all kinds. Some of these topics may be of a highly sensitive nature to certain listeners, particularly those that have experienced or are experiencing them, and could trigger some emotions that are upsetting or distressing. I've created this space to speak openly about these topics with the broader goal of helping individuals cope, adjust, and adapt constructively to the many challenges at hand. With that said, thank you for joining me. Antithesis, Episode 13, Serendipity. Hello everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. Following the production and posting of the past couple episodes that are really coupled to each other, culminating with opportunism, a theme that we emphasized very early in this series is becoming clearer in its importance. And hopefully, many of you listeners are becoming attuned to this recurring theme. And that is the importance of keeping a wide open aperture to everything for everything. It is not to say offhand that this is some kind of genius level advice or even anything beyond what could be equated to the ubiquitous conversational quip, "I'm keeping my options open." But sometimes the simplest lessons, even from the slightest of phrases such as this, can be so difficult to process and then to engage, depending on context, experience, and the perspective of the beholder in that moment. Or maybe the perspective of the beholder after many years. Much of how this podcast series starts, and along certain lines it continues, is a blend of considerations, and in some instances, stark warnings, for making the best preparations possible for whatever lies ahead. The familiar quote from Benjamin Franklin might fit reasonably well: "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." But maybe Oscar Wilde is more the vein I'm thinking of for today's topic, from his play An Ideal Husband in 1895. "To expect the unexpected shows a thoroughly modern intellect." After doing a bit of digging, this is a famous requote of the philosopher Heraclitus: "If you do not expect the unexpected, you will not find it, for it is not to be reached by search or trail." And the online discussions of that last quote are plentiful, since it seems to be you can't make a plan for the unplanned, all you can do is be ready for it. At least that's my interpretation. So for scientists and folks delving into research and development in every area under the sun, you are embarking on an adventure. From the very first moment, you start your training, and I'd say even sooner than that for most of you. The more curious you were at the youngest of ages, wanting to know why things worked, and more deeply, how things worked. To pursue an understanding of the unknown, to you, at that moment, was the first step to throwing yourself at the whim of nature, and essentially our entire universe. And because the trials and tribulations that can and do follow in this pursuit of research and discovery can have their own unique twists relative to other professions and endeavors, as I inferred in the last episode, that as researchers and specifically academics, we can really tend to constrain ourselves professionally and otherwise. And this can lead to incredible efforts to focus, but it can also lead to truly detrimental fixations. Then again, as I stated just a few moments ago, this can be and is an adventure for everyone desiring to uncover the mysteries of the world and our universe. And today, having been given a bit of inspiration by a former colleague and friend that has also been through the gamut in both academia and industry, I want to cover the positives, the absolute beauty in the unknown, and encourage fully academics and my non-academic listeners to drive towards those pursuits that might not necessarily have the logical answer or an exact anticipated outcome based on the rules we know, but potentially something more interesting, more important, more beautiful, upon which whole sets of insights and established rules may need to be bent or broken, instances of and increasing the potential for serendipity, and how we need to think about the harnessing of serendipity and exacting this as a force multiplier for discovery. So, Frankie Kisses, this episode is for you. For the whole cadre of folks that might be tuning in, how much of a line is there separating luck from serendipity? This is some wild fodder for online discussions, and this will not be the forum for that discussion. But simply put, the word luck, referring to some ethereal force that beckons good or bad, just doesn't have a rational place in science. Now, before some of you listeners take offense to that statement, I will be the first person to state that superstition in science, particularly dealing with technical approaches and so on, no doubt has a welcome place for many, just like baseball or other sports. Now, I can also flip on that to say if there are elements to your processes and procedures that seem to make things work consistently, then I'd attribute that success to a consistency in craft and process. Nevertheless, if folks want to sprinkle in the concept of superstition in there, then by all means, whatever floats your boat. Actually, a bit of personal reflection about this. I think many of us in the sciences use or have used that expression as a matter of humor and even habit, superstition, and sometimes as a sort of an admission of not having ultimate control over whatever learnings and lessons that we may be able to successfully glean from nature and the exacting standards that discovery demands. But adopting ideas of superstition as some form of actual function in science, again, this becomes more of a conversation about psychology and not so much about science. No less than a consistency in practice is really more what cooler heads would call it. But I can admit firsthand that when you are treading into new territory of research, and especially when you have inherited a new procedure to follow to prepare something needed for an experiment or a protocol to perform an experiment, it can sometimes feel pretty daunting as you start that journey. And the expression, it's more art than a science, is also used frequently enough to suggest that going by feel matters more than something concrete in a procedure or effort. And while that statement is odd, it for some reason does find a home in scientific circles, and I've used it and many others do too. And non academics tuning in, well, we've used the cooking or baking example in prior episodes, and the same applies here. And what a great example, too, because what are those key elements of cooking? Salt, fat, acid, heat. And those four words typify all of what define the underlying processes involved in the cooking of food. In fact, both the book and Netflix series I can't recommend enough by that same name, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, from the author Samin Nosrat, provide the basis and so many fantastic examples that there really is no magic or superstition otherwise involved in those endeavors, cooking, baking, etc. All the fundamental rules of chemistry and physics that delineates what happens in your pot or pan. Chance only favors the mind which is prepared. Louis Pasteur, in 1854, as the Dean of the new Faculty of Sciences at Lille, France. So, as we admit that the only thing that we can control in science and nature is how we approach it, how we study it, how we quote unquote control ourselves, it really does amplify the idea yet again that we have no control over where our research and our efforts toward finding the truth will take us. For we do not get to define the truth, no matter how badly we want to be able to define it. And I think this is a very important point to remember and critical to emphasize to anyone on a journey of discovery that the broader and more open you're thinking, of course, based upon knowledge and insights gained to date, the more likely you are to uncover the biggest surprises and potentially the most rewarding discoveries that might open up entirely new avenues of investigation. Sometimes it can feel empowering, even incredible, to disagree with what seems to be the party line for a thread of research because you permit yourself a whole new view, maybe only on a tiny facet of something that just doesn't sit right with you. In some ways, this can literally become play as you start to think in a way novel for most others, and that can be fun. These can be invigorating times where you feel like you were wearing a whole different set of glasses than everyone else. Now, not to raise the challenges here that come with this, because of course, when you create something new that further expands or possibly even challenges convention, all the founded experts in that space will come right back at you, sometimes vociferously. But for now, let's just get back to the making of your new space, of your catalysis of serendipity. The purpose of serendipity itself, for the sake of the search, and not just because you believe you already know the solution to a mystery, is what can free a mind and help soothe the pressures that might be coming from all angles, including expectations of answers that would only support data gathered from your past, your project, or anyone else's, including your advisor. Admittedly, many of you listeners may already know full well examples of what has been called serendipitous in the past, and very recently, some that will be familiar to you all, whether it was the discovery of aspartame, otherwise known as NutraSweet, or even sildenafil, otherwise known as Viagra. Yeah, these were serendipitous. Now, these are unusual examples in the sense that they came from chemical processes and product development, and there are many, many other examples for products that arose due to serendipity, but also major discoveries in basic research. And again, I think it is important to clarify any blurriness when it comes to how serendipity can be engaged by anyone that is pursuing answers and honestly, to simply demystify it. During our earlier prizes episode, we talked a bit about the nematode or worm called Serendipitous elegans or C. elegans. And the fact that this tiny roundworm exploded on the biology scene was not due to the original intention it was studied by Nobel Prize winners Sidney Brenner and John Sulston, which for them, it was to have a simple, easy to care for multicellular organism with a nervous system that would be straightforward to study and gain some real understanding in how a nervous system works. But nope, this didn't matter for most folks at first. It was eventually the fact that genes that appeared in C. elegans also appeared in humans and other organisms, by the way. And as you may recall from the prior episode, all of a sudden, biologists started to care. But it's in humans too. Amazing. Now, in the end, Brenner and Sulston won the Nobel Prize because, as a part of their work, they were able to trace every single cell of this roundworm and where they were positioned and the general functions they play right from the moment of being a fertilized egg. It was a fantastic basic discovery, and they did win the Nobel Prize for that. Now, for the biologists and other scientists on the line, and for non academics as well, you've got to understand we're talking 50 years ago when Brenner published his first paper using C. elegans for experimentation and put it into the realm of what we call a model organism for research, like others, E. coli, Drosophila, the fruit fly, and C. elegans, or Arabidopsis thaliana, which is another plant model organism that's studied very deeply. So there were a lot of wide open questions in every area of biological research, and those indeed were the heydays, where the first deepening understanding of many fundamentals of life were coming to light. I mentioned my former colleague Frank earlier in this podcast, and as it turns out, he was right there in the thick of these developments. And some of the work he did started with a pretty fundamental question, but one it seems not too many people were yet willing to ask. Are humans and worms really that different genetically? I mean, talk a bit how crazy this might sound, but is it? And I think that's really intriguing, again, because the concept of doing biology decades ago, we needed systems to be able to look at, to do genetics with, and to identify what genes were doing. And it wasn't even just about sequencing DNA yet. It was trying to understand form and function from the very basics of these organisms. And you can't study humans to do that. So it was based on experimentation of these organisms that eventually became models. But the question was, well, really, will fruit flies have the same or similar genes to humans? Or will worms, or will plants for that matter? Without a doubt, some of the beauty that Frank and others intuited in these genetic systems and then pushed it into the hypothetical and even serendipity phases was based on some relatively straightforward thinking about observations. Worms eat, worms reproduce, worms sense their environments. And what do I mean by that? They have receptors that allow them to have the equivalent to taste, to smell, to touch in the form of heat sensing. And they even have receptors that allow worms to see through the sensing of UV light. And nope, worms don't have eyes, obviously. But again, yes, I mean, worms having receptors for taste, just like we have on our taste buds. So, as experimental studies were being performed on these tiny roundworms, scientists were able to trace every single nerve cell that was formed and functioned using microscopy. And Frank was studying a class of genes and proteins called the G coupled protein receptors. They're called GCPRs in humans. And he was inspired to search in this new model organism, this small roundworm, to determine if they might also have the same genes that serve many, many different functions in organisms, including the function of nervous systems. Well, lo and behold, he was the first to find that there indeed was a human gene for GCPR in C. elegans. And again, I think to have every one of you tuning in to try to imagine what this was like 40, 50, 60 years ago and beyond, for anyone to take a leap based on some intuition, some reflection, or even what I personally like to call listening to the biology, to try to make a direct comparison between a worm and a human, or a fruit fly and a human, or even a pea plant and a human. The serendipity in encapsulating form and function and reflecting on the fact that every single organism has goals it must achieve for survival of itself and its species, but they all have their own environments, their own methods and approaches, essentially their own keys to success. Serendipity in things that can look and behave seemingly so differently, but in the end, share so much in common, from the oldest redwood to a single celled bacterium. From this, the takeaway is the need to maintain that freedom of thought, that openness to possibilities, and sometimes the requirement for and power of going against the grain, no matter how tiny the observations and maybe the disagreement that you might have with the rules that are written, or the possibilities where no real rules yet exist. In espousing and fostering serendipity, there's real strength and freedom to anticipate and be resilient when the answers you are getting don't fit with the models that stand at present, while also giving you the opportunity to look at questions and problems in an entirely new light. I'm hoping that thinking about serendipity in this way feeds into a greater sense of empowerment for you and can help reinvigorate some excitement in places that might have become drab, tiresome, and maybe even difficult or painful, especially if expectations are high internally and or externally for some anticipated outcome of your research or your work. Broadening your scope of thinking and enabling an expanded pursuit of serendipity in and of itself will hopefully help shine some light on that darkened path. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. But whatever you do, keep it by your side as a part of your adventure, wherever it may lead. And with that, thanks so much for joining me today. And I hope you look forward to our next episode that will be released in a week's time. And no matter on which platform you heard today's episode, if you enjoyed it and want to hear more, please subscribe, follow, like, and share. And set your notifications to let you know that next fresh episode is ready for you to dig in. All of you, keep building up your courage, hang in there, and keep your head up. We'll talk to you again soon. Continuing 30 years of experience with stories in and beyond the academic realm, Antithesis is a podcast that will take these perspectives and philosophies and pull them, along with you, the student, the researcher, the innovator, the educator, into the sunlight. Join us for some firsthand experiences, insights from inside and outside academia, and perspectives that are aimed at redefining the conventions of academia and your training, with the aim of helping you reorient your compass and strengthen you on your journey forward, or to recover and grow from those times past. We'd love to have you follow us and tune in weekly. If you have a topic you'd like discussed or a challenge you are facing you want to share, email us at allsystemsgo@gmail.com. That is ALLSYST3MSGO@gmail.com.